In this video, we're going to look at some of the further foundational topics for the rest of the course and get a little bit more technically deep into set theory and how it applies to decision making. Okay, so certainly one of the things about economics is we're interested in the creation of value. So what we want to experience and who we want to be are foundational to finding value in the things we have and what we do. So if certain choices increase our ability to do what we want, they provide us utility value. If those choices increase our pleasure from what happens, then they provide hedonic value. If they increase our remembrance of what has happened, they provide sentimental value. And if they increase our financial net worth, then they provide exchange value. Now, this is not to imply that these are the only four types of values that are out there. Rather, this is to lay out how the concept of value is not monolithic. There are all sorts of types of values, and by recognizing these distinctions, it'll make it easier for us to discuss elements of behavioral economics and what it is that we're actually deriving when we make the decisions and choices that we do. So in economics, when we talk about utility, we typically talk about utility maximization, and we use a hypothetical measure called utils. And if you're talking about hedonic value, then you could talk about hedons. Now, how does this relate to decision making and choosing? Well, if making a decision does not have any impact on the probability of events, right? In other words, you make a decision and it's not going to change what's going to happen whatsoever. That doesn't mean you know what's going to happen. It could still be uncertain, but if it doesn't change the probability of what will happen, then it has no utility, right? The hedonic value of making a decision, though, is dependent on the decision-making process. So you can understand it as the pleasure derived from making the decision as compared to the pleasure derived from the alternative that is selected. So if the process itself is enjoyable or pleasurable of making a decision, then there's hedonic value from making that decision, right, as compared to the utility derived from its consequences. So why is that so important? And by the way, this also, you can make that same kind of distinction when it comes to choosing. So why is this so important? Well, some people prefer to make decisions emotionally or using tools such as tarot cards, and they're willing to forego the consequential benefits of typical or traditional economic reasoning. On the other hand, others like to take their time making decisions, right? Gather the data, think about it, reflect upon it, and so they may put a lot more effort into making decisions, even if it's not really going to give them much of a benefit in terms of the outcome. You might be familiar with the phrase paralysis by analysis, which often talked about in dealing with management and planning. That's the same kind of idea here. If you really like reasoning things through, you might end up spending a lot of time and energy reasoning when you could have looked at the situation and recognized, okay, thinking about this isn't going to help me a whole lot. I'll just make my decision, make my choice, and move on. Now, this brings up a notion of dissonance. Now, those who are familiar may have heard the term cognitive dissonance, right? So this is the psychological stress associated with holding contradictory beliefs, ideas, and values. And related to this would be behavioral dissonance, right? So that's what would be associated with the physical stress of attempting to realize opposing actions, right? So if you're thinking about a bar of metal, and you try to bend it in two different ways, you're putting stress on it. You could break it. You could certainly damage it. So you've got cognitive dissonance, you have behavioral dissonance, and so economic dissonance is the stress of attempting to satisfy competing priorities, which is almost always the case in economics. So the greater the difference between them, or the greater the gap between them, the greater the dissonance. Now, we're going to want to talk about experiences and events. And this piece here is going to be, like I said, foundational when we, in a couple of weeks, talk about the role of time in economics and decision making. So what we experience is composed of events. And these events may be moments, they may be paths, they may be spaces. Okay, so what's a moment? A moment describes an event without duration, right? It is something we experience as if it is a point in time. Paths describe a series of moments with duration. Okay, so if it's a path, there is an elapsing of time. So where you start and where you end, whether or not it's in the same location or the same behavior, it will be at different times. And then spaces. So space is a container of moments, paths, or other spaces, which are sometimes referred to as a subspace. So when we consider what we're experiencing, is it a moment that we're experiencing? Is it a path? Is it a space? This has major implications for how we relate to it in terms of decision making and choices. For those who have some background with econometrics, these distinctions between moments, paths, and spaces will show up, for example, in longitudinal data, where the frequency or the time frame of the data becomes relevant. So, for example, if you're talking about yearly data, annual data, often in macroeconomics you're dealing with that, or quarterly data every 3 months. It's treating that whole year, if it's annual, or that whole quarter, if that's 3 months, as if it's a single moment. So when we talk about moments, they don't necessarily have to be a fraction of a second. If they enter into the decision-making processes data where everything is accounted as if it's a single observation, and hence a single event, then it's being treated as a moment. Okay, now to get a little bit more technical, feasibility, acceptability, and sets. All right, so to be more precise in our language, we're going to use the language of set theory when discussing what is feasible and acceptable, right? So the coulda, shoulda boundaries, right? So alternatives are possible outcomes. They make up the set of all imaginable outcomes. The feasible alternative set includes only those alternatives that one can choose. And the acceptable alternative set excludes all those alternatives that one should not choose. So let's take a closer look at set theory. So there are events and sets. All right. So a set is a collection of elements like events or outcomes. And typically you have curly brackets, and whatever is inside of it is separated by commas. So this, what you're seeing, is a set of three things that could happen. You could study, you could sleep, you could work. So those are the three elements in this set. Okay. A subset is a smaller collection of elements, all contained within a larger set. So the set study and work is a subset of the previous set, which was study, sleep, and work. Now, a single element is also considered a subset. So work, while it's just a single element, is also a subset of that first one of study, sleep, and work. And then there's something called the empty set, which has no elements in it. This is also referred to as the null set, and you'd either see it as these curly brackets with nothing in it, or the zero with a cross through it. That also represents a null set. So that's a set with no elements in it. Okay, some important symbols. All right, so this symbol means an element of. So, for example, 1 is an element of the set 1, 2, and 3. This means the intersection of, right? So it's a set that only includes the common elements of two sets. So if the first set is 1, 2, and 3, and the second set is 2, 3, 5, and 7, then 2 and 2, 3 and 3, those are the only common elements. So the intersection of 1, 2, 3, 2, 3, 5, 7 is going to be a new set, 2 and 3. This means the union of, and so this is a set that includes all the elements of both sets. So if you have 1, 2, and 3, and you have 2, 3, 5, and 7, then you would have 1, 2 in both of them, 3 in both of them, and then 5 and 7. So you'd have 1, 2, 3, 5, and 7. Notice you don't have to do 2 and 2 and 3 and 3. Those are the same elements. Okay? So in the union of two sets, you're going to have at least as many elements as the number of elements in the larger set. In most cases, you'll have even more than. Okay, so how does this relate to probability? Because this is going to be very important going forward. So a probability describes how likely a particular subset of alternatives is to be realized. We typically write the probability of an outcome X as capital P little r of X. So that's short for probability of X. So a single unique event, being a subset as well, can have a probability. So that's how we get to talk about the probability of something in particular happening. Okay. A probability of 1 means that subset is certain to occur. And if that's a unique event, then we're saying that thing is definitely going to happen. A probability of 0 means a subset is certain not to occur. And so a probability that's greater than 0 and less than 1 means it's a subset that is neither certain to nor certain not to occur. It might occur, right? So if you talk about, getting hit by lightning, the probability is way less than 1, but it is a little more than 0. On the other hand, if you're talking about the probability that the sun is going to rise tomorrow, it is pretty close to 1. Well, depending on your view of how the universe works, maybe there's some infinitesimally small amount that it won't occur. So the higher the probability, the more likely that subset is to occur. And the sum of the probabilities of all feasible alternatives then is going to be 1. In other words, out of what you can do or what could happen, something's going to happen. That's all that means. Okay? So when you look at all the things that could happen, one of them is going to happen. And so the probability of over all the feasible alternatives is going to be 1. Now, the relationship between feasibility and something called conditional probability. Okay. So an event or set of events, X, that are infeasible would have a probability of 0. In other words, they are certain not to happen. That's what it means for something to be infeasible. It can't happen. Right. So sometimes choosing is what makes an event go from something that might happen to something that is certain to happen or certain to not happen. All right? So in a world where you have some influence over the realization of events, the probability of an outcome is dependent on what you decide and choose. So such probabilities are referred to as conditional probabilities, right? The probability is conditioned on your decisions and your choices. So a person's will is their focused intent to realize a specific event. Right? So if X is an event, then X little w is a person's will toward that event. So a person has nomicity, I'm going to call that N, if by willing an event, they can make it more likely to occur. So the nomicity of X would be what is the probability of X happening given the person's will toward that event. So that, in essence, is a conditional probability that X occurs given that XW is willed. Okay. So if we're going to generalize with the existence of many people, many people's wills and many people's experiences, then the ith person's will and nomicity with respect to the jth person's experience will look something like this. Now, this is a very advanced way of understanding this, but this is how we can start talking about how one person's will and nomicity can impact someone else's experience. Right? So this is a world where we're not isolated, where it's not a world where what I do has no impact on you. This is a world where what I do, what I intend to have happen, has some impact on what happens in the world. And what happens in the world shows up as an impact on other people's experiences, not just my own. So if a person has no particular will for an outcome, as we've talked about before, then the outcome is considered natural. And so the nomicity will just equal the unconditional probability of an event, right? There's no impact on the probability of events occurring. Okay, now we talked about willpower before, now we're going to get a little bit more technical. So willpower is the capacity to change the probability of an alternative to be realized. And this is how we would calculate it. So the willpower of person I on the jth person's experience, and by the way, if J is equal to I, then we're talking about the impact on basically our own experiences. So the willpower will be the nomicity associated with the will and the experience minus the probability of the natural probability of that event occurring divided by 1 minus the probability. So 1 minus probability represents the potential to change the probability, right, from the natural outcome. And the numerator represents how much you actually do change it. So the willpower is telling us the fraction of the available probability to change that you actually do change. So assuming that a person's nomicity is not pathological, right? In other words, if they will a realization, they do not decrease the probability of occurring, right? Then willpower will take on a value between 0 and 1. Okay. So again, this represents the fraction of probability of X not naturally occurring and converted into the probability that it does occur. So a person is powerful if their willpower is greater than 0, and the power over one's own experience occurs when I is equal to J. All right, so let's say the probability of a politician winning an election is 20% if they do nothing. All right, so this would be the natural probability, right? They don't make an effort, they don't get any advertising. It's just based on people know that person. Maybe they have a 20% chance of winning an election that they're in. However, if they choose to campaign and they invest their willpower towards winning, they find that the probability of winning the election goes up to 60%. So we would calculate the willpower as 60% minus 20%, which in decimal terms is 0.60 minus 0.20, divided by 1 minus 0.2. So the 20%, that's the 0.2. The 60%, that's that 0.60. And what do we get? We get 0.4 divided by 0.8. So in this case, the politician has a willpower of 0.5, right? So by winning, they get to increase the probability from 20 to 60%. Now, what happens if their willpower was only 0.25? Well, if their willpower was only 0.25, then it would be 0.25 times how much they could change it. So how much you could change it was the 1 minus 0.2, or 0.8. So 0.25 times 0.8, that's 0.2, or 20%. And since the natural probability was 20%, it would be 20% plus 20%, or 40%. Okay, so that's how we can use an estimate of willpower if you were to know it, to calculate what the new probability was going to be. Okay, and one last advanced way of looking at what we've studied so far is an expanded framework. So before we talked about exogenous constraints and endogenous constraints, and also external and internal preferences. However, we can use these notions to go from a framework with 4 distinctions to a framework of 8 distinctions. So if you have exogenously determined constraints, but they're constraints about the external world, then we're saying what is feasible from the environment? What can you do with the environment? In terms of preferences, this is about how the environment influences what you find as desirable. Now, this becomes relevant because this is saying how things like advertising and marketing can impact you as a decision maker. Exogenous and internal would be about what is feasible of self, right? What can we choose from about who we are? And that would be the constraint that has these 2 qualities. And in terms of preferences, this is how the environment influences what inspires you. Endogenous and external would be what is acceptable of the environment. Okay. And in terms of preferences, this means that you choose what you find is desirable. And finally, endogenous and internal. This is what is acceptable from self. And in terms of preferences, it's what you choose, right, to inspires you, okay, or yourself. So this is just thrown for completeness. This is getting into things quite deeply. We don't need to do this, but just to throw something in there for those who like to get really deep into either the philosophical or the psychological elements of it. Okay, so that is the appendix to complete what we had did with chapter 1. And next will be chapter 2, when we look at experiences as a type of economic good.